Yeah, let's just kind of jump in. Jonah's probably going to jump in a minute as well. Name had a great question around, well, just to make sure I understand your question correctly, Name, like one thing that you wanted to talk about was how do you keynote the sacral when there's two channels involved? Is that correct? Yeah, right. How do you bring all that together? And then you've got hanging gates and stuff. So, yeah, that's a great question. Let me address that. So, we've got different things going on here, right? We've got the knowing circuit and we've got the abstract circuit, right? And each have their own dictates, if you will, each have their own kind of, way to be in the world. And so the thing is, this is a pressure for mutation, right? So these people are like frustrated, right, that things aren't changing, right? And so the whole key here is to really have acceptance, and then transcendence and mutation happens in its own time, which happens to be a capacity that the upper trigram lines in gate 60 can understand. Now, the sixth line's kind of looking beyond it, but when we look at David Lynch, we'll see he has fourth lines in these gates. And so because the fourth line is transpersonal and it knows there's another gate, right? There's a harmonic gate there. It sort of knows, okay, I'm going to meet gate 3 periodically, and we're going to be able to break through this stagnation, right? But these people deal with these fallow periods of stagnation, and they're like, ugh, when are things going to change, right? And of course, expectations are the real trap with abstract circuitry. So this person could be really in a hurry to transcend whatever limitations that they're in for the duration of the ride, right? For the duration of the ride that they're on, because that's really what abstract circuitry is, right? It's like a ride. It's a cycle, right? With beginnings, middles, and ends. So what this person really needs to do is to, have a response to be able to commit to the experience for the experience itself, experience for experience sake, right? And when they do that, they're going to find that that defines who they are and where they are, right? And it's going to, and what it means is that they have cycles in terms of who they are and where they are. Cyclical identity, right? But it's all about really surrendering to that experience, and to the extent that they really enter into it correctly, then they can have these discoveries where they succeed where others fail. Now, what I'm doing here is I am emphasizing, right? I'm leading with the abstract here. The reason why I'm doing it is because this is on and off. This is not on and off. You're always either entering into a new experience, or most typically, you're in the context of a prior experience that you've responded and committed to. So what happens is, think of this as the more immersive, constant context, right? And then from time to time, right, there's a mutation that comes through them, initiated through them, right? And they'll go through a period of confusion, right, before they establish order at that new mutation, right? They order that new mutation, right? So again, from time to time, throughout the context of their cyclical experiences, they're going to have these mutations which really change the game, right? And they have their fixed rhythms in all of that. They have their rituals in all of that, So I'm in some experience. I've got my fixed rituals within it. And then from time to time, there's a creative, mutative breaking through, right? So that's how I would summarize all that. Let me just pause a second and just ask, does that track?
I'm following along with you,
Yeah.
for sure. And I really appreciate, because I've got a number of 360s in my life, and wherever I read the keynoting was around chaos. And when I said, this framework of chaos to this person, it
Mm,
didn't resonate. And then I was also trying to,
mm,
kind of distill the difference between the 1762, which is around, making sense of details, or, taking all these details and then structuring it in their way with judgments and opinions, right? So
yeah.
there's some crossover, although they have their own, flavors of it.
Yeah. There's a difficulty at the beginning, right? That's kind of the thing. I think it would be get that person to track when they've suddenly brought a change right through in their life situation and be like, well, what was that? What was that change? And how did that process unfold? Right? Get them to really kind of track and remember, oh yeah, I did, and I don't really have an example off the top of my head, but there was this, breakthrough where suddenly I was doing X, Y, and Z, and be like, yeah, in that beginning, it was murky, right? It was unclear of how that's all going to kind of land and congeal and solidify, So that would be one thing. And remember, they're entirely unconsciously defined, which is always, there's a lot of implications there. That's a juicy thing, right? So when this person introspects, this is the same case with me, and it's a fairly defined chart, when this person introspects, they land on ideas about who they are, representations of who they are, rather than they're not looking at their life force and their subjective awareness, right? They're not able to look in and see their nature. Now, at some point in their life, you become an adult and you've learned, who you are, but you're looking back at memories. It's very different than being able to kind of look in and say, yeah, I just know that I'm whatever, an intuitive person, So there's a lot of confusion about who they are in that sense. The other thing I wanted to bring in is, what do you think would be some of the things that would tempt this person to enter into an experience incorrectly? What is the expectation story that they have? We can find that in the chart. What am I going to get? What's that carrot dangling that they're chasing? Right? That is going to lead them astray, that's going to lead them into experiences which bring failure as opposed to success. Because remember, that's the binary here, right? There's either this serendipitous successful discovery where others fail, or there's the binary. You're going to fail where others succeed. And boy, I have this channel, I know it, and Jonah does as well. And it's like, I can look at some life experiences and be like, I pulled off something extraordinary. And then I look at other things and think, gosh, like I couldn't make that simple thing work, that everyone gets, so it goes both ways. But if we look at the chart and we look at kind of how to assess the non-self here, we know what that mental, how is the mind going to goad them into entering into things incorrectly in order to get what? What's the carrot? Gate 7 or 8 for sure. 100%. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting too, like this is probably going to come up in our analyst, the relationship thing, but they're partnered with a manifester. So I don't know if that's maybe where you're pointing at, is like, wanting to have their impact or
yeah, right,
express out.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they're, if they had the 7 or the 8, they would be a manifesting generator, right? It would change the game for them. But, they're looking to make a contribution in some sort of leadership role, right? In order to find security, right? For themselves and for their tribe. Right. And so those are some of the things that could lead this person to enter into the wrong experiences. If I do this, then I can finally get to that leadership role and make a contribution. And this whole cross of laws is all about bringing change to rules and laws. It doesn't have to be directed at the political sphere, although it can be. I've gosh, I did a reading for someone who said something pretty funny about this cross. I mean, he's in his 30s, so it's not fully matured, but he said, "Oh, I can see this cross at play my whole life." He's like, even as a kid, I would be the person playing, like, I don't know, Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, and I would be the rule maker. I'd be the guy that sets the laws, you know. Or I did one pretty recently for a linguist, and that's rules and laws, but she was also very activist oriented. So it can look like different things. But yeah, you know, there's, you know, and so, you know, another way we could catch this story is this person's really driven by power. You know, I need to be best, do best. You know, I have a hierarchical way of seeing things. You know, I know what change I need to bring to my community. I know what's best, right? But inadvertently erring into power dynamics in this leadership role they want to have, they want to make a contribution in. And what makes it even juicier is the gate 50 line 4 personality sun is called corruption. And we've talked about this one many times. I'll just restate it briefly for whoever doesn't know. But basically, the corruption that Ra's talking about is the 4th line kind of has like horse blinders on, right? It doesn't see left and right. It's got its one track. It's very fixed in that way. And so the corruption he's talking about is they're just going to be fixed and relentless at making that thing happen that they want to externalize, that thing happen that they want to influence other people with at all cost, regardless of any information that comes in and says, you know, that might not be that good for your tribe and for your network. You know, they just can't put it down. So, you know, they think they know what's best, you know, here with the distraction, you know, best to address the fears of the tribe, you know, and their own existential fears, right? So these are all the different things that could really get them to enter into experiences incorrectly. And, you know, and then once they do, it's going to just magnify the melancholy and depression. Like, why am I in this experience? Because it's not going to be satisfying if they entered into it incorrectly. And then they're going to feel like this stuckness. Like, when am I going to get out of it? When is this ride going to come to an end? You know, that's what happens with abstract circuitry. Is it's very much like, when's this going to be over if you don't enter into it correctly? You know, it runs its course. Would you bring in gate 27 distraction? Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, that's a big thing here, is that this person is definitely, because we know that any of the gates in the incarnation cross, right, if they're not part of a channel, so this is looking here, right? 3 is not implicated because it's part of a channel. But yeah, I mean, it's like, what do I need? You know, they have fears, right? Driving what they think they need to do to care and nurture themselves and other people, right? And this is going to be
also, sorry, just which could then also link up with their open solar plexus, not self. Because they talked about in relationships that, you know, maybe when it got hot and heavy or, you know, intense, they like wanted to bounce, but, you know, had a little struggle with that.
They got over, like, so they easily get overwhelmed in relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, because for them, because we know that there's 3 things going on here, right? There's a mental conditioner, an i.e. a not self gate 37, and then there's these 2 dormant gates, which are effectively conditioning receptors, right? So, but the way that this person understands the emotional domain is through those gates, right? So in other words, they're saying, you know, I've got to be really generous and supportive to my friends and family in order to get love and affection, right? And that'll keep me safe. If I'm loyal with my friends and family and I'm supportive and I get their back, then maybe we can avoid a conflict and a crisis, you know. But for them, they really link these themes of crisis and conflict with emotionality. It's like, God, emotional people quickly can bring you to a dangerous place, you know, and that really scares them, you know. Yeah. Is it all tracking from your experience with this person?
I mean, I've given them 2 readings, so well,
Mm.
3, but yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
it's tracking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
And also what you shared, because I've inadvertently been bringing this person up when we've, when in conversations that you and I have had, recorded or not, I'm not remembering,
Hmm.
but you're talking about or keynoting 1156,
Yeah.
that ideology thing.
Yeah.
That's a big, and they're partnered with somebody. Basically, you'll see the configuration stuff, but who has 1156. And when they did talk about, processing things around, where they've struggled, it's about how somebody else isn't agreeing with their ideas.
Yeah. Right. Um, yeah, so I want to just take a quick look at the wheel here. Okay, so the 56 is looking at the 31. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I know this one. Um, so basically the 56-6, as I recall, um, is kind of like saying uh what's really worth believing in, what's really stimulating. Um, they're kind of done with the whole abstract, right? And they're looking at this next gate in the wheel, which happens to be 31. They're like, no, what I really want, what's really meaningful, is to influence the future, to influence the collective, right? To find something that really works, a pattern that we can really trust, right? So they could be, again, it's interesting because the 56-6 looking at the 31, and we already know by virtue of the split definition that they're looking for the 7 and they're looking for the 8. So it just reinforces and compounds that story of like, I need to be an influential leader. I know what's best. I know how to protect us, I know how to keep us safe, and doing that in a very blind, fixed way. And, not necessarily delivering on that because of that fixed, narrow fourth line perspective that they have. But there's a real preoccupation with becoming a leader here, you know. Yeah, it's interesting to see that stuff. Yeah, anything else about this chart, or should we jump to another one? I don't know if Nangshi or Casey or Jonah has anything.
Yeah, I thought that was all really interesting, and I'm really enjoying this. I know you were going to look at David Lynch at some point, and I wanted to see maybe the difference of the 360. Could I see his body graph? Yeah,
Yeah, so
that's the only channel. Yeah.
yeah, it's same incarnation cross, different version of it. I don't remember the nuance between the two, but fundamentally about bringing change to rules, laws, so on, right? Law as an art form. But yeah, I mean, very interesting chart. I guess the first question is, does everyone know who David Lynch is? It's not particularly interesting conversation if not. So David Lynch is I would call him an art house kind of surrealist filmmaker, but he really broke through. He broke through. Oops, I was going to highlight that into the mainstream, right? So I think his first breakout movie was Elephant Man. He did Blue Velvet, Lost Highway, Twin Peaks, very famously, Mulholland Drive. Anyhow, if you're interested in those kind of slower paced art house kind of movies, then he's worth checking out. But he's an interesting character overall because he's got that. So he does these very experimental movies that many of which have actually done fairly well. They've been palatable enough for the masses, despite the fact that they're weird, And then his whole demeanor, his whole affect is very Midwestern. It's very, gosh, golly, gee, type of Leave It to Beaver type, which you don't expect from a guy that makes these dark kind of noir, surreal films, right? Anyhow, a couple other things of note about him. He was famously really struggling with depression as he was getting his career going. He was actually living in Philadelphia. He was going to like this art school out there, and just struggling. And anyway, finally got this first breakthrough movie, which really impressed upon people like George Lucas and all these other things. He actually was invited to direct Return of the Jedi, which if you see any of David Lynch's movies, you'd think, oh my God, I can't even imagine, how he would handle Return of the Jedi. But anyhow, so he had this depression, which eventually resolved with transcendental meditation. So now he's kind of known for being this kind of art house filmmaker and this advocate of transcendental meditation. He's got a nonprofit that tries to get that sort of teaching into public schools and things of that nature. So all that said, here we have David Lynch, right? We can go through, maybe we go through his incarnation cross. Right off the top, we know that, of course, meditation is going to be interesting to a guy that has a right mind, right view on top of that, right? And a completely open ajna and a completely open head, right? So he doesn't know what the hell to think about, And of course, there's a fear here. The ultimate fear of the ajna is that life is a bit scary without certainty. I've seen this with children. Children that have a defined ajna aren't as concerned about nailing down concepts, right? They're not like, Mom, so wait, this is right and that's wrong, and then when this happens, that has to go like that, right? That's the open ajna, needing to kind of nail everything down, right? To deal with their own internal anxiety about the fact that everything is kind of questionable and debatable, right? So meditation would be a viable answer to that. And of course, on top of all, just look at this chart. 4 completely open centers, right? And so the keynote for a completely open center as opposed to an undefined center is, I don't know blank. I don't know what to feel. If we're in a difficult situation, I don't know whether I should hug you, or do I cry with you, or do I laugh, or do I give you space? I don't know what to do, right? And then this not knowing what anything is worth, including himself, right? Right, which is reinforced here. It's like, oh, what has enduring value? Yeah. So it's pretty unusual to see 4 completely open centers. That's really something. He's really objective to a lot of different themes. So let's start with his personality sun, gate 60, line 4. So gate of limitation, right? And there's a really great line that headlines this gate that probably my favorite line in the whole Ravi Ching is, the acceptance of limitation is the first step in transcendence, right? The acceptance of limitation is the first step in transcendence. You have to be where you're at, right? You have to be where you're at. And one of the gifts, as I mentioned a moment ago, when we're looking at Name's example chart, which is the same cross, is that the upper trigram here, i.e. the 4th, 5th, and 6th lines, they know that there's a 3 on the other side. Now, he knows that, especially because he's got the whole thing. It is unconscious, but basically because they know there's a 3 on the other side, they know, okay, I feel stuck right now. I feel limited, but change happens. That's the potential, and that's why this line is really called resourcefulness, and Ra says it's about releasing oneself from the pressure to mutate. So when David Lynch is at his best, he can say, okay, mutation is going to happen, right? It's going to happen in its own timing. And this line's surrender, so I got to surrender to the mutation that is going to happen in its own timing. However, he does have it detrimented, right? So it's fixed in that direction. And what it means is that he is, rather than accepting it, right, he is beaten up by that, He gets depressed by the fact that there's a stuckness, right? It says a tendency in times of limitation to seek the inner meaning of the restriction rather than using its gifts to find a harmonic application within the limitation. It's a bit of a jargony sentence, right? But it's basically the energy to know rather than accept the limitation, So he knows it. He knows there's a limitation. He's just not accepting it. And that leads to depression, right? That leads to depression. And we know that that's something that he has grappled with in his life. So if we look at the personality Earth here, 56 line 4, the wanderer, right? The gate of stimulation. The line's called expediency. And so basically this is the gate in line of the guru, the sage, the teacher, etc., which again kind of plays into this meditation theme. Not that I really see him necessarily being the guru there, but he's somehow sort of an advocate and involved. And really, this is the gate in line of the storyteller, the person who's got parables, that are stimulating, parables that embedded within them, there's beliefs about life, about, how life should be lived, what makes life meaningful, what gives life sense, right? And so the wisdom here is you don't have to believe your own story. You tell a story to get information across. That's it. And the detriment here is believing your own stories and kind of lying to yourself, or using storytelling to make sure everyone sees you, everyone notices who you are. It's an interpretation. I can kind of see David Lynch falling into both of these camps, both having effective storytelling, and then sometimes it feels like it's just a show to be seen, and that's just kind of a judgment call on my part, 50.6 design sun. Oh, this isn't surrender. Actually, this is surrender. I guess it's the 3.6, right? Yeah, the 50.6 is leadership, right? So, and it's really this strength to maintain one's values, while having a harmonic relationship with others. In other words, what I see here is here's a guy who's really unique, who's really creative, who's really far, far, far out of the box. Yet he's able to have a harmonic relationship, right? I mean, he has a harmonic relationship with Hollywood, with mainstream. Like, he was able to be a guy that could pull off really extraordinary, very avant-garde, right, type movies and get along, right? And get along. And even potentially be looked up to, right? And seen as a person of integrity, as a role model, etc. Right? And so because we're looking at 6 lines here, we always have to look at the next gate in the wheel, which I happen to know is gate 28, line 1. So, he is someone who he's looking for values, right? He's looking for values that provide a sense of meaning and purpose in life, right? 28.1 is really preparedness, So the heading of the gate says the transitoriness of power and influence. The desire to be effective manifested in the application of energy to detail, right? Your details help assess the risk to see what's safe or not, what's meaningful or not. It's not about blind risk taking. It's about prepared risk taking, So he's very much looking for like what makes life meaningful and purposeful. And, that's the life he led. I mean, it's an extraordinary life. He's not a background character by any means. And finally, we come to gate 3, line 6. This is difficulty at the beginning. And this line is called surrender. And so really, it goes back to the gate 3 theme of like, which is all about establishing order. There's been a mutation. How do you ground that mutation, if you will? How do you, help that, structure that, help it come into existence? And, what the 6th line here is saying is you do it through surrender. You do it through surrender. It will happen. You don't need to force that. You don't need to fight through your confusion. You just have to have the courage to let things mutate and emerge and solidify in their own timing. One of the things I really admire about David Lynch is that I remember him saying in an interview one time, and it's really interesting when you look at his need motivation and the fact that he has an undefined head and nausea. He said, someone was asking him some questions about intellectual matters. Maybe, I don't remember what it was, but his answer was, I don't consume this other stuff. I'm not reading these opinions and these theories and these philosophies and whatever. I prefer to know things that I need to know and in my own way. And it was basically a real statement that honored humility, honoring the mystery, honoring the fact that he doesn't really need to know, which is true from both of these places. It was a real maturity. It's like, yeah, I don't need to know everything. And if I do need to know something, I'm going to sort that out in my own process. Right. It just really felt like such a surrendered statement. What else would I say here? Well, gate 3, line 6 is looking at the next gate in the wheel, which is 27, line 1, which is really about nourishment and caring, being selfish, right? So, first you have to surrender to the confusion, and then you take care of yourself. It's like, I'm just going to take care of myself through this fallow period or through this confusing, chaotic period until things really solidify, right? And we look, he's an artist, right? And so we look at Venus here, which standards, morals, mores, values, beauty, all of the things that represents. This line is about the ability to maintain inner harmony when confronted by external limitations. I mean, you would have to have an internal harmony to pull off what he pulled off, to make really avant-garde movies that the mainstream accepted. Right? He must have hit all kinds of limitations in terms of funding and in terms of, right? But we know that David Lynch, therefore, values mutation. He values mutative beauty. He's also a painter, does really avant-garde painting, stuff like that. Mutative beauty. He values transcendence, right? So all these different things. I'm just riffing here. I don't know if anyone sees anything or has any questions or comments about anything I've shared or.
Yeah, I love all these comments. I'm a huge David Lynch fan. I've seen everything he's done, most of it multiple times. And I remember some years ago, I got really curious about his design, and I thought it was cool. He was a 360, and then I looked up, and he's a 4.6, and then I looked up Kyle MacLachlan, because Kyle MacLachlan kind of plays an alter ego kind of protagonist, and Kyle MacLachlan's also a 4.6. But he's on gate 55, line 4. So he is actually on the gate 55 wing of the Sleeping Phoenix. And he only has one channel, the 3420. So each of them have only one channel formed by their incarnation cross, a lot of openness. However, Kyle MacLachlan has a lot of hanging gates. His head center is the only completely open center. In the case of David Lynch, you have 4 completely open centers. Something really interesting we saw last week with Peter Berv in his Gurus, Comedians, and Rock Stars series was when we looked at these gurus and mystics, they had a lot of completely open centers. And we had a more than regular amount of completely open centers. I have a completely open solar plexus. I could definitely see how, in some way, that complete openness makes you a little more like a reflector in the relationship to the program and what's going on in the world at that time, and a little more of a channel for archetypal forces that have nothing to do with you. It's like it really has nothing to do with you at all, because all of where you are is in these other defined centers.
Yeah.
And see how many, I mean, looking at that throat and also the G center and the spleen, which have 3 each, I mean, he does have a pretty packed hanging gates, right? He has a lot of dormant gates and a lot of double gates too. A lot of personality and
Yeah.
design side highlighted, which to me is also kind of unifying forces together, like his design Venus and his personality Neptune. Even though they don't really communicate to each other because the design and the personality are so separate, they're nevertheless doing very similar missions. It jumps out to me when I see when I see that he's like doubly equipped. He's equipped in two ways to improve things with that spleen. So
Mhm.
yeah, so much openness. I mean, four completely open centers. That to me already kind of makes him a little bit mystical in those areas, like almost like an alien. Like he has 35 in the human experiential way, so that's his sort of connection to being a human. But then that completely open solar plexus can make you feel a little bit like an alien
Mhm.
experiencing these human emotions. And one of the
Mhm.
things I really like about David Lynch's films is that he'll surprise the viewer by showing very intense emotion. Like in Mulholland
Yeah.
Falls, he'll show singing that evokes the most amazing intense emotion. And then and people are crying their eyes out. You realize that they're lip syncing, and the person lip syncing gets taken away. And they're kind of like, what? That emotion was fake? Like, how is
Yeah.
that? I mean, it takes a completely undefined solar plexus to come up with some weird experience. Like, he wanted to share the
Right.
experience with the audience of how he experiences all emotion, basically.
Uh-huh.
So he makes films that
Yeah,
give you a glimpse into what it's like to be completely open in those ways.
totally. Yeah. And there's a lot of sexual themes in his films, and they're usually a bit unusual, and I think that is the mental condition or 36 and 6 here, you know. And there's a lot of his films. I mean, if you think about Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive, and Inland Empire, all have to do with identity, among other things.
Yeah, wow. They really do, though.
Yeah, it's those three are really, it's a 10-year period in his life or whatever it was where he was just really interested in the question of identity.
Yeah, he has a film where the protagonist wakes up in the jail cell and he's somebody else. He's played by a
Right.
different actor.
I
I mean,
know.
that's how,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And
That's
I
so
think
cool.
and
Wow.
I think the other one of the big things, I mean, it's so much more interesting to kind of have this conversation if everyone really gets David Lynch, but his movies don't have crisp, definitive black and white meaning or answers, and so he really has an incredibly healthy tolerance and a relationship with the mystery of life, and bringing you into that, and even the mystery of identity, you know um yeah, yeah. And the other
Well,
thing.
there's something I have one last comment on the G Center. So in my centers class, when we looked at the Steve Rhodes keynotes for the G Center, what he says, I mean, I love his observations. I think this is just the innocence of Steve Rhodes. He says, people that have an undefined G Center have a very high tolerance for people and places. And
Mm,
that is, you could think of it almost as a polite way of saying like they don't have good taste in people, places, something like that. But I think he actually means it sincerely, that the
yeah.
tolerance, their ability to tolerate going into the really nasty places and around nasty people. And look at David Lynch, look at the cast of characters in his films. I, as a defined G Center, have to have some amount of love for my characters and love for the people and love for the places and celebration of those things. And with David Lynch, he's really willing. I mean, Dennis Hopper's character in Blue Velvet,
Oh my
or Nicolas Cage in Wild at Heart. I mean, these are characters that a defined G might have a hard time enjoying, and yet from your and my own conversations with Von Paul, who also has an undefined G, he'll tell me stories about people from all different walks of life, and I think it's because the undefined G has the ability to be around so many different people. Yeah, well, and there's that love of humanity, love of the
God.
diversity. It's kind of like people of New
He's
York,
he's
including the
yeah.
grotesque, including people that don't
He's sort of
fit.
embracing the good, the evil, the whole spectrum. And what's interesting is this um Gate 60 in Venus has something to do with um moral hangups, seeing the world through the lens of good guys and bad guys, and that can contribute to depression. And if you think about his films, they're polarizing like that. They're almost, many of the films are, the characters are more caricaturized or archetypal. I mean, Kyle MacLachlan is this squeaky clean, boy next door do-gooder and everything. Oh gosh, golly gee, I just got a good cup of coffee and a slice of cherry pie,
It's so great that he's a 4-6 like David Lynch, and like David
Oh
Lynch has
yeah.
this kind of alter
They
ego 4-6 to
they
put
get
in
each other.
there.
Right, exactly. And then
Yeah.
think about Dennis Hopper, the character he played in Blue Velvet. I mean, if that wasn't the epitome of just unhinged evil, I don't know what
Yeah.
it is. I mean,
Really disturbing. Yeah, really disturbing
it's super
characters. Yeah.
disturbing. And so, he's filtering for all that stuff. And I really see that with the 15 here and looking at the world through this moral lens, and I imagine this translates to like, do I feel limited by goodness, or do I feel limited by there's something there about the limitations of morality that he wants to explore. What's on the other side of that? Let's look into things that people, wouldn't dare look at, things that might be a little cringy, might be a little seedy. I think he's curious about the limitations of good and evil and morality and these kind of codes, and yeah, I mean, that's very much, he's bringing change to codes and structures and rules and laws, right? There's a real moral bent to this psyche, right? A real moral bent to this psyche. Yeah.
Yeah, and I almost wonder if the moral bent is because in that complete openness, well, it's a good question. That complete openness, I'll speak as somebody who has an undefined solar plexus myself. I can see both at work, because it's not that the completely undefined solar plexus is amoral or sociopathic or anything like that. In fact, it's all the more able to kind of take in what the program says is normal, and in some sense have a changing value system that has nothing to do with the individual, even kind of detached from that. Like, I guess I wouldn't say value system, but there are values in the solar plexus. I mean, basically the relationship to the emotional world. Like, I see something in the work of David Lynch that he doesn't want to, he loves having over the top melodramatic, totally intense, emotional scenes, but
Mm.
not as a way to intentionally make you feel the emotion, but perhaps to question how the power of the film can give you such a strong emotion that can evaporate a moment later. So you're watching the beginning of Twin Peaks, the strings, everything, it's like over the top emotional. Like, he
Right.
loves these, and the screaming and crying, he loves to show it, but he's not showing it in
It's all fake,
the
right? Or
same,
it's all like
yeah.
he sees through well, he has wisdom. Here's what I would just say. I mean, I think what you just said is brilliant.
Yeah.
It's really unpacking him. He has wisdom about the transitoriness of emotion,
Yeah.
right? And I think what you're pointing to is, it's like, oh my God, it's this really heightened moment. But then with this reflector-like capacity, it's over. It's just over, Or
Yeah, and it's very
yeah,
mundane. And then he'll have some guy like sweeping the floor or something.
right.
Like, he'll kind of
It,
bring it back to
yeah.
the
Like,
mundane grittiness
exactly.
of reality.
It goes from a potential crisis and something so intense to like, that's done now, and then, and to your point with the lip syncing earlier, like, what was that really? What was really behind all that emotion? It was just a show, but when you talked about, you said something about values, and I'm thinking about, the
Yeah, I wasn't really even sure that's the right way to put it, but it's more just like, it's not amoral, I guess, in the sense of moralistic. Like, it's detached from things, but it's also in some ways it connected like the reflector thing. I think that what I realized looking at the mystics who had completely undefined solar plexus or undefined spleen or any of these things was that they were kind of idiot savants in those areas. Like, they
Mm,
were so outside of it, they were almost gifted, and they had a sort of relation to the cosmos, which doesn't mean that they're just born with some amazing ability to live their design or anything like that. They can get, I'm sure, it could get totally swept up in it. And I'm sure that David Lynch's use of meditation has really helped him to kind of decondition from a lot of these themes. So
mhm.
it's not just that because he's open, he would have that benefit, but I guess you can kind of see how it's this dichotomy where when they haven't deconditioned, they can be totally susceptible to just being an agent of the program, of basically saying these are my ideas, but they're not really your ideas. They're just collective.
Hmm.
This is the way that a relationship should look. Well, how do you know? Completely undefined, right? And so
Mhm.
those values can change. But in his case, realizing, yeah, he does have gate 50, so values do have something to do with him, but he doesn't have on the solar plexus side, he doesn't have those values. So I mean, he
No,
doesn't
but
have any, it's not really
I think
connected.
there's an inquiry here because this has something to do because it's a mirror of 50. It's like what are mm, the interpersonal values that can help us avoid conflict? Something like that, is here, just because of that mirrored relationship. Um, and I also wanted to bring in the fact that he's got 59 line 6, which is, eventually in the course of its life journey gets above and beyond sexuality. It's like, is that it? Um, and I do feel like his treatment of sexual scenes and topics is impartial, impersonal, kind of distanced in a way. I don't know that I can really back that statement up. It's just kind of an impression of he's not invested in a kind of gratuitous way. It's just part of the theater, if you will.
Yeah, he doesn't really have a lot of eros in his films in the way that some directors, they're eating chocolate and strawberries and they have the
Right.
candlelight and all of that. I mean, even some Kurosawa scenes that aren't sexual are very erotic because of the play of the shadows and the light, and you can feel the tension and the chemistry on screen. His aren't really like that. I mean, he does have some, he goes into some very sexually disturbing places. And Slavoj Žižek has actually done a great analysis of David Lynch's work in his documentary film on film called The Pervert's Guide to Cinema. And he uses David Lynch a lot because actually what Zizek says is very interesting, and I wonder if it's kind of what we're looking at here in the solar plexus too. Zizek says for David Lynch, part of what he's been able to do with film, and he does all of his own sound effects, he
Mm.
shoots like a match very close up lighting on fire, and you hear the fire sound effect like a like a
Yep.
way that no other film would have. Like his sound
Yep.
effects are so zoomed in and so loud, and you're so close to it, and it's so huge on the screen that it's like everything feels so real. And I almost wonder if those completely undefined centers, particularly the solar plexus, can have that ability, because I personally have had that too. I mean, I've had that of being in a heightened state where everything just seems kind
Mm.
of intense, like too real, or the intensity of the emotion, the intensity of the life itself is sort of too loud. I don't know how to
Yeah.
describe it.
Well, it's super interesting. So we know he's acoustic because he has individual circuitry, right? But beyond that, and we talked about sexual kind of deviation or perversion, that would be here. This is like, I'm going to explore all the different manifestations of sexuality, and he's got anyone who's got a hanging 35 has some sexual hangups and some sexual fears. They're worried that they're sexually inadequate and all that. But it's like, let's explore that. Let's explore kink. Let's see all these different aspects of what it is to relate sexually with other people. But when you're talking about sound, he's high sound. So what's interesting is you're right. He'll have a scene where someone's lighting a cigarette, but it's like the loudest lighting of a cigarette that you can imagine. Yeah. And he's also just acoustically sensitive. This is a wide valleys thing, right? So there's a certain acoustic sensitivity to the environment. Um, Related point regarding his PHS, I've read so many books and articles and stuff about David Lynch. I find him fascinating. He eats the same thing every day, which is his transference. I think it was like tuna fish on crackers or something. He's like, yeah, why think
Wow.
about it? Every day I just have my tuna fish on crackers,
That's so funny. Yeah, he is a real habit guy too, but he doesn't have five, so I wondered
Oh,
if
yeah.
maybe it's like, because 15 is like almost its own version of habit, but instead of habit, 15 is like doing something like every day religiously for 3 weeks, like, hey, I'm doing polyphasic sleep now, and then like never doing it again.
Never doing it
So the
again.
15s, I've seen how 15s will just get obsessed with something. Um, Von Paul is a 15. That's actually his personality son. And so Von will get so on a jag, like he'll just be on a certain extreme. And so it makes sense here for David Lynch that he has 15 twice, because when I've read certain things about him, he really gets almost obsessed about certain things. Like he will drink a lot of coffee by day and he drinks red wine by night. And then he got really into woodworking and he wanted to like solve the problem of the perfect coffee table. So he spent like a year building this amazing coffee table with like a wine caddy and the thing for the glasses and the drawer and everything. He just puts
Yeah,
so much energy into that coffee table for his wine bottle. But you can see that with the 15 a little bit. It'll go to those extremes, and also his 360,
yeah,
he really only has energy for doing stuff that's personally important to him. And
right.
everything about individual is personally important. You know, if he's bringing about something new, he
Yep,
wants to do something new and different, it's personally important to him. But also making a coffee table, personally important to him. And those are
yeah,
equivalent. He's not going to like,
right.
just because he's a filmmaker, he's not going to only make films. He also paints a lot, or he does other things. Kind of a little bit of that individual, don't tell me what to do. I'm not your
Right.
I'm not your arcade machine you can pop a quarter in and I'll play, or you know what I mean? He's like, I'm gonna make a coffee table. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I wanted to point out his outer vision tone here. So there's the preoccupation with the visual, with beauty, right? So, I've tracked that with a lot of great visual artists, filmmakers, etc. And then here he's very sensitive to the texture of his environments. And you can really feel that in the movies, the acoustics of the environment, the texture of the environment, making small little noises, as I said, louder than you would expect them to be, all of these things.
I'm also tone 6 on the design nodes, and I associate the tone 6 with like a certain, I don't know, it's a sensitivity to texture and also to kind of the history of objects and the history of places and the
Mm,
story of them and almost what they've been imbued with. Like I have a real love for weird old antique kind of ghosty things. I know that Ross said it could be the opposite, that someone with touch would actually only buy new objects, brand new, fresh off the factory, and they would be clean freaks who would scrub down the counter because they could be obsessed with getting off the energetic imprints. And I can relate only if it's a bad energetic imprint. If it's an energetic imprint that I don't enjoy. But I actually like the energetic imprint of something that's an old factory machine that was in service for 50 years and it
yeah,
made however many tens of thousands of rivets and different things on the service line. Like that's cool. Like and he kind of has that too. A lot of his scenarios, like especially in Twin Peaks, The Return, he had so many crazy machines and bizarre contraptions. Also going back to his early works, Eraserhead. He has a little bit of a steampunk adjacent
yeah,
mystical appreciation for historical objects that I also share, and I love environments like that.
yeah, yeah, 100%. It's interesting. I'm in touch cognition. I have some, used stuff, some new stuff. I think I err on the side of new. But every now and then I kind of come across something that, whether it's a original copy of a book or something that I really cherish, but it's very selective around that. The last thing I guess kind of catches my attention is Gate 11, which, fear of darkness here, fear that like, look, I look in the past, right? Because we're talking abstract here. I look in the past and I'm not sure that it looks like there's any hope for humanity's future. So it's a fear of darkness, both literally and figuratively, like the child that doesn't want, you know, they struggle to go to sleep because it's dark in their room and that makes them feel uneasy. But also like as an adult, it's like the dark forces of the world. And he's really explored that, and again, he's really going to explore that given that this is across from his personality Earth, and he's telling stories about darkness, right? Stories about darkness with sexual deviance, you know, where some impossible transcendence or breakthrough has happened around identity. I mean, we could just keep playing with this, it can go on and on. But yeah, fun chart to look at.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. Really, really interesting. And Nancy asked if we've looked at his dream rave.
I
I have
have,
not personally looked at his dream rave. We can see that he doesn't have any personality channels, so there's no way that he would have only personality activation. But yeah, with the different design, he very well might have something from the dream rave, so it'd be interesting
Yeah.
to see that. And with that 15 on the personality side, he definitely has a hanging 15 in his dream rave, because the personality stays the same when you go into the dream rave, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. So that has something, and actually he has 50 as well, Jonah, which would be, so I actually have these in my dream rave, but you know, this is I just blanked. Something to do with timing. There's an issue when people have this in their dream rave, they have timing issues in their day-to-day life. I'm blanking on some of the other keynotes. I don't know if you recall. I know this can be a preoccupation with sex and reproduction and that kind of a thing, which I guess contributes to the sexual themes of his films. My 15, waking up middle of the night, feeling disoriented and fear of darkness. Yeah. So that's me. I wake up in 15 times in the middle of the night. I wake up, I'm processing something, and I roll over, you know? Yeah. He's definitely dealing with darkness in his movies, morality, darkness, you know, corruption, corrupt value.
Yeah, and he has that gate 48, that gate of black magic too. So he
Yeah.
himself has some.
And looking at the what gate of white magic.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, Mike and I had a really juicy conversation about black and white magic at one point, which we should do at some point on maybe on frequencies or something, Jonah. But you know, it's like the 48 with the polarity with the 21. Black magic is about controlling the outcome, right? Whereas white magic is more of a surrendered type of a theme, right? Yeah.
Well, it's also, yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, the polarity of the 11 being the 12, which is kind of a secret about how peace, gate 11, gate of peace, relates to 12, which is a manifestor channel, and how manifestors impact and so on, and 12 being one of the primary gates of action. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
what an
but
interesting.
we have the monk here, and we have like 12-1 is the monk, right?
Mhm.
11-4 is the prophet. I want to say 12-4 is something else like that. And so you've got this
Yeah.
dynamic of like the monk is someone that embodies an ideal, right? Or the prophet is someone who teaches ideals and teaches beliefs about what will bring the light, you know?
Yeah, there are some really, really good playing that, polarity game. You can find some really interesting juxtapositions of gates that seem so different, but yeah, like you're saying, the secret to gate 48 is in gate 21. And when you
Yep.
realize the secret relationship between the two, how they both are seeking the same, it's kind of like each one uses its harmonic as a way of getting to their goal. So that
Yes.
48 and 21 have their shared goal. Now, the harmonic has its own goal, and gate 16 and gate 45 don't have the same goal. You know what I mean? Like it's
No,
you get
right.
into
Yeah,
like, but
sure.
it's somehow there's this polarity is kind of this shared. It's like there's 32 fundamental goals,
Creative tension.
and
There's
yeah,
creative tension there
it's a
because,
creative
you know,
tension between the two. Exactly.
and that's the thing is when you really think of that, when you think of the cross of tension, which I happen to be on in my Uranus opposition right now, the cross of tension people can have tension building up in their body to the extent that they're not living out their purpose. And so what you really learn here is that purpose is a byproduct of internal tension. And internal tension is the incarnation cross setup. These are two polarities, right? And it's only through that tension, it's through that crucible that we really shed the deconditioning and individuate, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Absolutely. Well said.
that's a really, and you know, the 360 is a square, which tells you something about individual circuitry because it's the format of all individual circuitry. Is that there's this feeling of like gridlock of like when can we get through this? I feel stuck, you know. And that's another kind of crucible for creativity, right? That kind of feeling of stuckness that you need to kind of be with, surrender to. But I wanted to say one more thing about the very interesting 48-21 dynamic because it really speaks to this illusion that logic has, right? Logic, right? As we can see, sorry, I'm being a little sloppy here. And then we know it goes up here, right? There's no ego in logic, right? So there's this illusion here that if I am aware of the patterns, I can control the future, right? There's a weird relationship that logic has with willpower. If I know the pattern, I can will it, right? And I'm a super logical. I got the channel of logic. 3 of my 4 incarnation cross gates are logical. So I have a defined ego, but I can see that. And I've tracked that with clients that there is this, you know, what the circuit is missing, it also has its own not self relationship to it. It also has its shadow. It has its preoccupations, you know, and logic really thinks it can do something willfully with the patterns that it has. And there's this polarity really encapsulates that. Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. Hopefully, y'all were interested in David Lynch because you got an earful. Very fascinating. Your homework is to watch Blue Velvet. That's the one I would say just dive into. Oh,
I love Wild at Heart. It's one of his lesser appreciated films, but it's just so weird and has so many great parts. And of course, crazy Nicolas Cage. And
yeah,
wow, I love Blue Velvet too. I've seen that one so many times.
yeah. We should
I,
do
s- I
movie night,
saw,
Jonah.
yeah,
We should do a David Lynch movie marathon.
yeah. I really enjoy his work. And then of course, I do want to rewatch Twin Peaks: The Return. I
Oh,
was
me too.
surprised to
Yeah,
find Mike is on his third rewatch. He's watched it 2 full times.
yeah.
So, and now he's on his third rewatch, and I've only watched it once all the way through, and I'd like
Well,
to
I'm
watch it.
going through the original series, and when I get to the return, you know, happily let you know. We can watch it together.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the mind of David Lynch. Um, yeah, it was fun.
Thanks, James. Really enjoyed that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all. See you next time.